What's going on at Houston ISD?
Of the changes that were going to be made here, one of them was to school libraries. They were going to be, I guess, changed from their original intent of being staffed with certified librarians and being used for the traditional things that we usually associate libraries with, to becoming essentially detention rooms full of desks and single file. So that way, students could go there who were either causing disruptions, facing behavior issues, or needed to get caught up on some other things there too. So let's just play the video, because then this will connect to what people know, and then we'll go back into the, I guess, the background and the context for it.
Right now at 6, libraries are being cut from some HISD schools.
Librarians are concerned the move will cripple the learning curve for students.
I actually think it's a significant disservice to the students of HISD.
The central office numbers.
Tonight, city leaders are also pushing back on Superintendent Mike Miles's latest move to overhaul the district. The district says the libraries will be converted to team centers for students with behavioral issues.
KPRC 2's Corley Peel live outside Pew Elementary with what this move means for current librarians. Corley.
Is Texas one of those states where they're doing these across the board book bannings? So the library themselves have already been cut of a serious number of these books?
Oh yeah. The book banning thing in Texas was big, probably at like this time last year. If you remember, there were these big releases of lists of books that would no longer be allowed on Texas bookshelves. And you saw the pictures. They're all kind of blending together now because obviously Texas, Florida, Iowa, places across the United States. But I think Texas was amongst the first last year where you actually saw those pictures of blank bookshelves, where you saw the book ban lists come out. And I think other states have really poached from those lists and those practices to see how they would function. But the other thing that's remarkable about Texas is they have these gigantic school districts. I mean, Houston is a enormous school district. I think they're pushing 200,000 students, dozens and dozens of schools. It's the Wild West, out there
Literally.
in Texas.
Yeah, Pew Elementary is one of the schools that will no longer have a library or have that librarian position. And Mayor Sylvester Turner also weighed in today, saying that this move is unacceptable. I spoke with some former librarians who say that this could hurt student performance.
A school library is a wealth of knowledge. Former librarian Lisa Robinson says it's full of some of the greatest stories ever told.
It was just such a joy to help them find that perfect book.
She says those stories, now ripped to shreds.
My heart is just broken for these children who are in the NES schools that are losing their librarians.
As of this week, librarian positions at 28 new education system schools are eliminated. The district says librarians at NES and NES-aligned schools can transition to other roles in the district. Libraries in 57 NES schools will be assessed on a case-by-case basis. Superintendent Mike Miles says students are behind on reading levels, especially in 4th grade. Former ISD librarian and manager of library services, Janice Newsom, says eliminating librarian positions will hurt reading performance even more.
When students engage in reading as an activity of choice, they are not only building that reading muscle, but they are also developing their vocabulary. They're understanding a bit about the world that exists outside of their 3-block radius.
The schools impacted are in predominantly underserved communities.
I just feel like, what commentary is there to add beyond what's already here? Of course, not having access to a place where you get books is going to impact students' ability to read at school. Although I kind of disagree with the framing. We should have books at school just because it's good to have books at school, not because of reading performance concerns.
In a lot of the videos that I watched, it may or may not come up in a couple of the clips that we'll go through, but in a lot of the clips that I saw, it's really just like a reprieve for students as well. So it's a space, it's a place where you can go and have some amount of agency and autonomy. You can go there to read. A lot of libraries today, that's not, school libraries in particular, that's not like the primary purpose anymore. They're a quiet gathering space. They're a study space.
It's also a safe place, which concerns a lot of the folks that are concerned with banning these libraries. They're spaces where kids go who are bullied or ostracized, the library is usually the place where they can escape and be surrounded by support networks.
Our less fortunate students are the ones who suffer the most, primarily because many of them live in situations that are reading deserts, okay? They simply don't have access to the reading materials. They don't have choice in the reading materials that they are given to read.
Robinson hopes the district can piece back the stories that students may never learn.
There's a direct parallel here to the fact that the folks who are banning the libraries are also the people that don't want kids to be able to read books on their own and choose what books to read, because they might end up reading a book that has a gay main character or features a story that might have systemic racism in it.
If you give kids control over what they can read, oh my gosh, they might read something that's not on the test next week or whatever. I think the more that we look into this, we'll come to realize that this is just all about serving standardized test scores and giving kids a big open space to explore. It doesn't fit into the laser focus that Mike Miles, who we're going to dig into here as well, his vision that he has for Houston ISD. Do the NBC News one there. Let's do that one.
Right. Big changes this year in some Houston, Texas school districts, a district eliminating dozens of school librarians. The controversial reason why and how some families are fighting back. Here's Antonia Hilton.
Cherries and blueberries.
Houston mom Jessica Campos has spent the entire summer dreading the return to school.
I feel like I've spent my entire summer fighting. So coming here, it kind of, I can breathe.
Ever since her daughter's elementary became one of more than 28 schools in the Houston Independent School District, replacing their library with a center for work and discipline.
What's happening to the Houston schools?
It feels like they're being taken apart, dismantled, destroyed.
This summer, the state of Texas took over HISD, a district of almost 200,000 kids, a blue city in a red state. They replaced the elected school board members and swapped the superintendent for a charter school owner and former leader of Dallas schools. Some, like Houston Mayor Sylvester Turner, say it's a hostile takeover.
Well, Houston has been in conflict with its own state government for years. Okay, so let's not be fooled.
Because I know the links in advance, I know we're going to dive into his background a little bit, but very interesting that he used to be a charter school founder. I wonder if there's any connection between limiting what students could do and controlling students' thoughts and ideas and opinions, and also being a prominent charter school owner.
Yes, insert link to our view at Teach Like a Champion here.
Yeah.
Everyone agrees Houston schools needed to change. Some were failing. Many students fell behind in reading and math. District leaders tried to improve, and the state even gave them a B rating in 2022. They took over anyway and laid off employees and replaced libraries in underperforming schools so they could give some teachers higher salaries.
I can't afford a laptop for my kid. So books is where we get.
Worth noting as well, a B rating for a district that I'm assuming is probably in poverty, like many of the students are in poverty, is actually quite good. We know that zip codes correlate with test scores because of lack of resources, amongst many other issues going on in school and in the community.
A B rating, in my opinion, doesn't necessitate this kind of hostile takeover mounted by the Texas State Education Agency of one of the largest urban districts, of course, a very poor district as well, there in Harris County in Texas.
Only in America would we say the way that we fix schools that are failing is by getting rid of the library. Very, very strange conclusion.
You could see there in that clip what the new library setup looks like, right? All the shelves where there used to be books are now pushed to the side, and they have the desks in individual rows. Again, this is just like a detention space, for misbehaving kids to go get sent.
It's wild too that you can tell just what they value from the design of the space itself. It's not just that they're converting these spaces into detention centers, but they are destroying the space as being usable as a library at all. They've not only crammed as many desks in as possible, but like look here on the left, you wouldn't be able to access these books. They've positioned the bookshelves just out off the side like no one's ever going to use these things.
Jessica's daughter Sophie is starting 5th grade at one of the new education system schools.
I barely know how to read. I just started reading this grade because my English teacher helped me a lot. Or stripes.
She says the library was a place where she could practice.
I say and.
Superintendent Mike Miles understands families are anxious about change, but he argues books will still be available on shelves, and these team centers where students will work or go when they are disruptive will help kids like Sophie catch up.
In a district where there are so many kids who are struggling to read, why disrupt the library of all places?
So reading is key. We may not have librarians, but even in this room, books are on the shelves.
Do you believe librarians are important?
Every single position has value. We can't be all things to all people, and we can't have everything we want.
So does that mean you're robbing Peter to pay Paul?
No, I mean, I wouldn't phrase it that way. What I would say is we're putting in a bold, different model that works.
Jessica Campos considered busing Sophie to another school, away from her neighborhood and friends.
I don't even know what to say. What he's saying is exactly what he thinks. It's a bold new plan to turn libraries into detention centers. They're not even debating the claim that it's happening. Typically, when folks like this go about changing up schools in very authoritarian ways, they'll wrap it with a lot of positive, flourishy language to make it sound like it's something that it isn't. Like, oh, these are going to be spaces where we're going to bring joy back into learning by having kids work on interactive activities together, something like that. But in this case, it's like, well, I mean, there's still books here, but we're going to help them catch up. It's bold.
Another parent concern that I saw, her kids, one is diagnosed with autism and the other with ADHD. And she said her concern is that, right, his behavior will be treated and punished. And he will end up spending time in these detention-like spaces and be excluded rather than be included in the general education class. So
I would bet everything I own that's how that's going to be used, because that's already how it works. Kids who are ELL or kids who are on IEPs are almost always placed in these remedial type courses that are hyper authoritarian and dehumanizing, because when we measure learning as this binary track of you're behind or ahead and you catch up just by doing more stuff that's rote based, this is the natural end of that line of thinking. You put a bunch of kids into a room and drill them and kill them.
So let's get into a little bit of the context here and talk about why this is happening in the first place. And of course, one of the things that will be part of this conversation too is so much of what we've looked at in the context of like the education culture wars has been around this issue of so-called parents' rights, right? We need to give parents full transparency, full opportunity for choice, full all of these things. And yet, with this takeover of Houston ISD, it seems to be in contradiction to what the local elected officials want, what the mayor of Houston, who's elected by, the people in the community want. It's not what the parents of the kids who send their kids to these schools, it's not what they want, but it's part of, again, this takeover by the state.
Slippery slope is real. One of the scariest things to know, and you and I both have history degrees, we've studied this kind of thing, is that authoritarian rulers, they come to power by small incremental changes that slowly authoritarianize, if that's a word, a country. And that culture war stuff isn't just people being very silly online and saying a bunch of dumb things. This is a school that is transforming all of its access to free and public information in the library to detention centers.
I would say this is not a super huge arm of the culture war, right? But it is just interesting to say how parents' rights, on the one hand, when you're talking about predominantly white suburban schools, is like the big cudgel that they're going to weaponize to be able to get their way. And here, the voices of the predominantly non-white parents in a predominantly urban environment that are largely poor and impoverished families, their voices are not valued in the same way, right? The Texas
which is exactly why we need to ban talking about systemic racism, because we might be able to find that out and talk about it. I mean, they're directly connected.
The situation here is that last winter, basically like January, February, this plan was announced that the Texas Supreme Court was going to allow this restructuring of the Houston Independent School District. And what that meant was basically the state was going to come in, they were going to fire the superintendent, fire the board of directors, which is not what they were called before, but they're called that now, which is interesting, and rehire basically the management team. So come in, give this new guy, Mike Miles, who had previously been the superintendent of the Dallas School District, another huge school district as well. And you heard, of course, he was a charter school CEO at a certain point.
He used to be part of the Dallas ISD, and 8 years ago, after 3 years as superintendent, he didn't show up to his last board meeting.
Yeah,
because it sounds like while his management methods laid the foundation for some future success, they also left behind various scandals, caused veteran educators to leave the district, and ultimately test scores remained relatively flat. The article starts talking about how Miles' plan for Houston ISD is similar to a program he started in Dallas before he resigned with 2 years left on his contract. That program, which launched after Miles resigned, gave teachers huge pay bonuses if they boosted standardized test scores in some of the campuses with the biggest needs. Some low-rated campuses saw improvements as part of the program, but scores fell again once funding dried up and teachers left because they weren't being paid the same.
And then, like the article says, when the incentive pay dries up, so do the results. So it's not a sustainable system.
Yeah, so it says that Dallas still uses that evaluation system, but questions over equity have arisen, as most of these high qualified teachers were not going to schools that needed them the most. This is not rocket science. The schools that are in the greatest need of assistance when it comes to highly qualified teachers or teachers who are raising test scores are not going to work at the districts where, again, the zip code nature of how standardized test scores are allotted and given are not going to make that easy. Like, why would I work at the district that has students failing across the board on the state test when I could work at the district that has most students passing the state test if I'm getting paid for passing the state test? Here, from John Marsh, wrote this book called Class Dismissed, and the subtitle was Why We Cannot Teach Our Way Out of Inequality. And the thesis of the book is quite simple, which is increasing standardized test scores doesn't make people make more money. Like, that's about it. The way that you solve test score crises and poverty in this country is you enact policies that eliminate poverty.
It's not entirely true that raising test scores doesn't make people more money, because it makes Mike Miles a lot of money, because he gets to be the superintendent of these school districts for 3 to 5 years and then take his money and leave. In fact, as we get to the scandals part of this, that's one of the reasons why he left, is because he failed to negotiate a contract that also would have included like a bonus for himself. And when he couldn't do that, he ended up leaving. So let's look at scandal after scandal.
Just really quick, I want to add on this point because it's like directly what I was saying. It's not an effective management tool to say that test scores are going to be the driver of reforms. He's an associate professor of educational leadership and policy. DeMatthew said, test scores don't predict all that much about what happens to students in the future. It's a systemic problem. If you grow up in poverty, the chances of you moving up the income strata are minute in comparison to those that are born into the middle class or the upper class. And the exact same way that going from the upper class to the lower class during the course of your lifetime is a very small percentage of people. You tend to stay where you're at when it comes to your income level.
They're hinging all of this success on turning around test scores by any means necessary, even if it means that veteran teachers end up leaving, right? The most experienced teachers who probably have the most to add to the profession, and for kids, they're gonna leave because they're not gonna put up with the conditions. Newer teachers who are more willing to put up with those things, right? We saw the impact of dehumanizing environments on kids, all of these things. So let's get into the scandals here a little bit. We arrived in Dallas in 2012 after a successful stint with a small school district in Colorado, 6 years with Harrison School District, applying a similar teacher evaluation program as he used in Dallas. Now he's trying to implement in Houston. After only 3 years at Dallas, leaving after he failed to negotiate changes in his contract, he wanted to forbid school board members from searching for a new superintendent while he finished out his last year, and wanted access to a retention bonus. And the Morning News described his time at the district as turbulent, saying it brought disruption and controversy. This is really interesting. The people he brought with him from Colorado paid them 6-figure salaries, more than twice what they were making before, One of them, his chief of staff, resigned after facing a federal indictment of taking kickbacks that he pled guilty to in a prior job in Atlanta Public Schools. His head of human resources resigned after instant messages between her and another executive became public, which poked fun at race, religion, and age and discussed ways to get rid of employees. Yeah. Also, an investigation found the executive director at Dallas ISD's Human Resources lied about her criminal history, bullied a coworker, and falsified a report that was given to trustees. She was hired during Miles' tenure. Miles himself also violated district policies. At one time, Miles had Dallas police remove a school board member from a middle school she was visiting. Pretty incredible, using the police to bully school board members. And so that's on the scandal side. Even on the test score side, if you scroll up there real quick, Dallas ISD consistently met standards set by the state, but failed to show any significant gains under his tenure. Great. Only some subject areas saw slight increases. In others, test scores slightly decreased. The number of schools that were in good standing also dropped, while the number of failing schools increased under. So yeah, what a great recipe, inviting scandal and unethical practices at the same time that test scores remain stagnant or even decline.
Math scores slightly went up, and not necessarily even on the state test, but the turnover rate increased from 12% to 22% within 2 years, which
Almost
is
doubling.
Shockingly fast.
Yeah.
So we did all of that work, put together all these documents, hired all of these nefarious actors, probably did a lot of really authoritarian stuff for a little blip on the math test score. At what cost?
Somebody made a lot of money.
I mean, we're looking at one of them right now.
Before he got into education, he actually is a graduate of West Point. And he was involved in the military. He actually worked for the State Department. And Chris, you'll appreciate this. He was actually a diplomat to Poland, international affairs and public policy, Slavic languages and literature, the military. So that's his organizational perspective comes from, a military background. It has no pedagogical training or any kind of education experience outside of his work as an administrator in school. If you were just a parent and you went to Houston ISD after hearing all of this drama about this takeover and you saw a score of a B, you would wonder kind of what's up. But look at that, almost 200,000 students, 273 schools. And of course, most of them, as I had said before, are non-white. The vast majority of students are Hispanic. There we go. 80% are categorized as economically disadvantaged. Okay, so in Texas, what is then the correlation of these school ratings and whether or not they are charter or a traditional school, whether or not they are low poverty or high poverty or whatever? And the most recent state report that I could find from the TEA is from 2022. And so what this gives on these bar graphs is the accountability rating and then sorts them by the school type. As you can see here, the low poverty schools, 79% of low poverty schools scored an A, compared to only, 18% of high poverty schools. 0% of low poverty schools scored not rated. So that would traditionally be a D or F. No school, low poverty schools would be rated a D or F in 2022, compared to, 10% would be rated a D or F that are high poverty schools. Failing schools are simply a function of coming from communities that have high poverty.
There's some cognitive dissonance here because, of course, you want to ensure that kids, especially in the most marginalized communities, are prepared for the workforce and for college, and they have skills that make them marketable in our society. But that's a Band-Aid solution to the bigger problem of the kids don't have access to the same things that everyone else does in order to get to those positions in the first place. It's not that we shouldn't focus on individuals and ensure that individuals can be successful, but we also need to focus on systems and recognize that the systems those individuals find themselves in make it very difficult to progress at the same rate as everybody else.
I'm willing to bet, looking at this chart, that the kids in low poverty schools have school libraries staffed with librarians. I'm willing to bet that schools in those low poverty, kids who go to those low poverty schools don't have the same emphasis on accountability, testing, discipline, back to basics, all of that. Our solution, our response is always to try to punish poverty with austerity. All right. It's to paper over the impact of poverty on education with all of these other things that even in Mike Miles' own career, even in his own tenure, don't work. So we understand now, the context, kind of putting a lot of the policy changes and the faces to these. But now the school year has started. So what is the reaction of parents, of teachers, of kids?
Mm-hmm.
Here is one of the responses from a teacher on the ground to say, well, a teacher just walked out, quit at my school today. There's definitely talk among our campus of other teachers contemplating leaving. I read in this group that a science walked out of another school last week. This is not the norm. This is really scary and sad. Is this happening on your campus? I don't think parents in the community know or understand what's really happening behind the walls of our schools.
As a teacher, my students are the most important. That's what's driving me nuts. Offered a district position a few years ago, which I refused because all I wanted to do was teach. I always had high scores on my observations. Suddenly, I am considered ineffective and need to do better. Turning my students into little soldiers is not what I want. I will do better. Giving my student no chance to be expressive is not what I want to be effective at. Not having my students socialize with each other is not something I want to do better at. I have already had 3 students tell me I hate this and I want my mom to find me a different school. This one isn't fun anymore. So you can score me whatever you want. I will try to make it through the year, but next school year, this good teacher will be in a district that isn't turning students into classroom soldiers, and it isn't keeping students from being expressive. I mean, this is the natural end result of, quite literally, I mean, could we make the argument using military tactics? I mean, the guy does have West Point experience.
What his background is in, that's what I'm saying.
So, I mean, it's no different than the natural end result of converting, scare quotes, failing schools into success academies or uncommon schools or any of these other districts that are designed to drill, kill, and slightly increase test scores for a lot more funding.
So what they did when they went through, when Houston Landing went through here, they actually took an inventory of the things that they saw inside. And as Chris and I had alluded to earlier, a lot of it looks like the uncommon schools, teach like a champion model. I mean, it's not exemplary in that sense. You would just find that charter school playbook unfurled here.
Big timer, some textbooks, some worksheets.
Yep, kids all wearing the same shirts here. Regimented, but not sterile classrooms. Yeah.
Regimented, but not sterile classrooms. Several unifying elements. We have a learning objective on the board. Thank God.
Wow.
Posts and instructions for an activity for students to complete. Plastic bins with stapled worksheets. Desks clumped into pairs of 2, each with whiteboards, highlighters, pencils, dry erase markers, and a large paper note card. And then at the front of the classroom, teachers cue students to participate in the lesson. Teachers were given guidelines on what you're not allowed to do in the room. No clutter, no couches, no plants, no outside lighting fixtures, and as a result, no comfy reading nooks or makeshift classroom libraries. Could you imagine going to a professional development session and they tell you, hey, your classroom is not allowed to have collections of plants in it? Good Lord, there might be some fixture of happiness inside our room. But no,
Right.
the fluorescent lights are a cornerstone part of the classroom experience.
Yes. No lamps.
Each teacher had some vibrant bulletin boards with floral, marble, or neon patterns. They colored it. So they still got some stuff going on, but man, it says, but for the most part, signs instructing students on classroom policies filled the walls.
Libraries and classrooms transformed into team centers. This was, of course, his most contentious policy. Library shelves bumped against the wall. Seas of desks filled them. Students who misbehaved in class could be sent to the repurposed libraries for a cool down until the end of the period. However, administrators said few, if any, students had needed such discipline in the first week. This is what I was going to say. Probably in the first week of school, these spaces are largely going unused, and that's kind of what it says here. Webcams in each classroom captured a broadcast of the lesson in case students were sent out of class to watch from a team center or at home sick. That's pretty great.
No.
Although I say,
I didn't know that they put cameras in the classrooms too.
I didn't either. It's really interesting though. I think, right, having accessibility for kids who can't be in school is great, right? I think more accessibility is going to be better.
I'm
The
also
day-to-day.
very skeptical about the idea that it actually makes it more accessible. No one actually addresses or designs for the fact that there are people online. So as a result, you have to work twice as hard to figure out even what's going on. And I would bet that it doesn't translate. Like, it probably doesn't make any sense to try to figure out what's going on. You probably don't have actual access to the resources that are in the room to easily follow along. And I think that actually puts more of a burden on the person who's not there, because now they're required to be online, but it's not adapted for the fact that they're not in the room. And I get the fact that that's more difficult and more work for teachers, but this is a systemic failure, not an individual teacher failure. This one has the teachers aren't the only ones teaching. They basically have like paraprofessionals or teacher apprentices that are patrolling to make sure the kids are quiet and working.
Look at this. At Sugar Grove, an apprentice's quick raise of eyebrows and shake of the head redirected a student's wandering eyes back to their worksheet. When a student started to fall behind in pace, the apprentice was already at his desk pointing to the question he needed to work on. So they're there to keep the kids in line. Keep your eyes on your worksheet. Don't let your attention and your mind wander at any moment. Look at this last paragraph here. During a math class, he interrupted the lesson to ask questions of students as a teacher would. At McReynolds, an assistant principal walked into the back of one classroom, tapped a whiteboard with MRS turn and talk, indicating to the teacher it was past time to incorporate one of the multiple response strategies, and quickly strode out. What is that? What is happening here? It's just inflicting their will on classrooms of kids and teachers who probably are doing just fine, but because they're not sticking to the letter and the minute of the script or somehow off task.
Miles is claiming that students are going to have less homework because the model's so intense they don't feel like they need much homework. No time for tomfoolery. Students usually spend the first few days of school getting to know their classmates, discussing their summer break, and learning fun facts about their teacher. But not this year. It was straight down to business on day one. Teachers began delivering curriculum upon the first bell. It's wild to me that we would take pride in the idea that kids don't get to know each other or learn fun facts about their teacher on the first few days of school.
No, what school
just
is for, Chris.
completely joyless. And he walks across campuses operating under his newly implemented model, making sure that people that don't adhere to his vision stick out like a sore thumb. He's not shy about correcting them.
Yeah. They asked Houston ISD parents and staff how they were feeling about this first week, and these are some samples of the replies saying horrible, students are overwhelmed, crying and complaining as the teachers were giving tests on the first day and enormous loads of nightly homework. Superintendent Miles has to go. It was a nightmare having the door open, which was one of the requirements, so that way the admin could walk in and out. Yep. Caused my AC unit and ceiling to begin leaking. I had to teach with constant dropping on my tech equipment and me. This will definitely be my last year at HISD. I feel like I'm working under a dictatorship. The school has been transformed overnight into a corporate-style charter school with a hostile working environment. I've been sleeping very poorly out of stress. I've worked too long every day and still feel unable to meet the rigid expectations of the district. Even if there are some gains in student achievement, which seems unlikely, the juice will not be worth the squeeze. Nearly every teacher is talking about looking elsewhere, even the most dedicated and hardworking. I would not want to work this way for $120,000 a year. When the current model at my kids' school doesn't allow them to discover interesting lessons on stuff they care about, it's just drill and kill, drill the child with questions and kill their curiosity and joy of learning. I'm going to have to supplement a lot at home this year. It's not even what parents and kids want. This was a hostile takeover from the Texas Education Agency, a statewide takeover of Houston Independent School District that has over 200 schools, of course, across a range of performance, come from a range of different communities inside one of the largest urban areas in the country, all required to be managed by this dude, Mike Miles, whose background is in the military, not in education. And we're seeing the consequences of that. The studies have shown overwhelmingly more money for schools helps low-income kids. If you simply make high poverty schools into low poverty schools, they're going to turn around overnight. In fact, one of these studies was done in Texas, Chris, which is why I wanted to pull this up. So they ran this pilot of 875 school districts from 2003 to 2010. They compared outcomes in districts that got extra money to districts with less. And in fact, an extra $1K in per pupil spending raised test scores. High school dropout rates fell, college enrollment jumped, college graduation rates increased. Gains were particularly large for school districts with more students from low-income families and more Hispanic students.
What I think is important about this as a case study is, one, people should be advocating about this because it's happening to real kids right now as we speak. School hasn't been going on that long. This is a public school district. People can push back and advocate for policy changes that do not occur like this. It already happened. The guy was essentially booted from his last school district because people didn't like what he was doing, in addition to all of the nefarious financial stuff that was going on. But speaking to that as well, I think this is the reason why it's important that folks are educated on the natural end result of thinking inputs and outputs and test scores are how you run schools. Because if that's your mode of how you think about education, this is where you end up.
The Dallas schools that Mike Miles was at prior to this, that formula didn't even work to raise test scores.
Is it really worth to raise our math standardized test scores by 2 or 3 points if it means that kids aren't allowed to talk to each other and we have webcams in every single room tracking what people are doing and we get rid of all the libraries? I mean, come on.
So thanks so much for watching. Remember to like, subscribe, and comment if you're a Houston ISD parent or community member who sees an issue with this. Let us know what your experience is like on the ground there. Thanks for watching.